Good afternoon, and I'm Liz Walker, and this is From the Heart. We are live streaming to you today, and of course, with the live stream comes all of technology's challenges and all of technology's glory. So we will move ahead no matter what. A couple of weeks ago, hundreds of ministers from all over the country converged on Minneapolis to join thousands of others for an interfaith protest against federal violence. Theirs was a peaceful action, what some believed might exactly be a turning point in this whole thing, a crack in the ice, if you will. Sadly, they were confronted with more violence within hours of their arrival. Among those preachers, our special guest today on From the Heart, my good friend Dan Smith. Dan is the community minister at Catuit Federated Church. He's a chaplain and teacher at Harvard Divinity School, and he's a member of the Can We Talk Healing Network. Dan, I am so excited that you saw fit to join us today because I know you're a busy man, but thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I remember when you made this decision to go to Minneapolis, and it was not one that you made lightly. How and why did you make the decision to go and be a part of a very dangerous situation?
First, thank you, Liz, for having me on the call. Always a delight to be with you. Well, it wasn't an easy decision, but it was a quick decision. Part of that had to do with the fact that I was writing a sermon like I do on a Friday afternoon or a Saturday. And I was writing about Selma and about the kind of church basement level spirituality that was behind the movement in Selma, the trainings and the practice and the rehearsals for some of the major actions of the civil rights movement. And around that time, I was about so far into my sermon, and an invitation came through from somebody that I know and trust. And the invitation actually echoed the call that Martin Luther King put out via a telegram to other clergy at the time. And I said, okay, here's my chance to walk the talk. And so I responded pretty quickly, but it wasn't an easy response. I think if I'd given myself more time to think about it, I'm not sure I would have, but I preached the sermon. I told my congregation that the call had come in and I was going. And after church that day, they created a beautiful sign of prayers for me to take with me to Minnesota. So I think the other part of the reason why I said yes was because I wanted to bring a witness. Many people have been asking, what can we do? And not everybody was able to go, but I was able to go. And I wanted to bring some of the heart and the prayers and the encouragement. But I also wanted to learn. And I wanted to learn about what were those basement level practices that they were exercising pretty clearly. And I knew the person who was inviting me, and so it was easier to say yes.
Now let's dig a little deeper into the experience. You were there for 3 days. It's the middle of the coldest winter that most of this nation has had. There is nothing inviting about the specifics, or at least of the geography and the time of being there. But it wasn't just a matter of going there and grabbing a sign and protesting. There was a process to the pastors and the ministers' experience there. We have some pictures. So Micah, if you could pick up the pictures and show us, and Dan, if you could explain what we're seeing in the pictures.
Sure. First, there was a call held on the Monday before we went to kind of orient us a little bit to the organizing ecosystem of communities of faith and nonprofits that had been on the ground. They did started some training with us then, but they also made clear that they didn't even have this idea until 6 days before we gathered. I flew in on Wednesday night. They invited us to gather at this church on Thursday morning at 8 a.m. And they didn't tell us where the church was until just before. They were insistent about digital security and invited us not to post any photos or communicate. They invited us all into Signal chats and loops. Signal is an encrypted app where you can send messages without as much concern of surveillance. So we all arrived at this church and we're told that there were 600 people, 600 clergy who responded to this call. And they had to turn 300 clergy away who wanted to be there, but they didn't have the capacity. Thursday was a day of grounding, of orientation, of hearing stories, of uh, life lived under siege, really. And they used that language. They used language of occupation and told story after story of encounters with ICE that were brutal. They also grounded us spiritually. We sang together, learned resistance songs together, and they began to do some training in non cooperation and non resistance or nonviolent resistance. Halfway through the day, they had a labor organizer come and tell us about an action that was going to take place the next morning at the airport. They weren't going to share hardly anything more than that, but they said if you are feeling moved to risk arrest in 5 minutes, we'd like you to come and get on buses, and we're going to take you to another undisclosed location for training for that specific action. And about 200 of us uh, gradually or quickly moved towards those buses, and I went there for that training. Later that day, we learned that they only wanted Minnesota clergy to risk arrest because they didn't have the legal support for out-of-state clergy to support them if they were arrested. And then the next day, they kind of deployed us around the city. Some went to the airport action. Some went to support communities that were packing groceries for immigrants who couldn't go out to do their grocery shopping. I went to an immigrant church that afternoon or that morning and heard from local neighborhood activists about their experiences and learned more of a sense of training. And during that time, you could bring up the next slide. We took a walk around the neighborhood right outside of this immigrant church that was several blocks from where Alex Preddy was murdered the next day. Oh, that's my colleague Rebecca. That was on Thursday where she welcomed us and but this is on that walk around the neighborhood. You see several clergy behind me there. What you don't see is how much of a ghost town that neighborhood is. Usually thriving community, people coming and going all the time. There was not another soul that we saw there, which was one of the ways that this reality came home to me, was knowing that there were immigrant families filling that neighborhood at that moment, but they were sheltering in place. Their window shades pulled because they were scared. While we were there, when we got back to the church, you could pull up the next slide. I'm not sure what this one is. Right. And then later that afternoon, I went to the memorial for Renee Good, and you can kind of get a sense of it. But the flowers that were on the ground there, they were stacked 2 to 3 feet deep. These bouquets were like banks of flower bouquets for a whole city block.
Can I just stop you to ask you a question? So one of the narratives about what's happening in Minneapolis, one of the narratives, these are organized agitators who are in the streets and they are representing, all kinds of Antifa or whatever. That's one narrative. But this is the church. I just want to emphasize that these are preachers and regular people, right? Is that who you encountered there? I'm sure they're organized, but they're regular people.
Well, they are organized, but they are organized neighborhood to neighborhood, neighbor to neighbor. There's not some broad organization that's telling them how to do it. That's what we learned in that church. You can take away the slide for now. So we were gathered in this church and heard from these neighborhood organizers. I've been correcting myself not wanting to call them activists because most of them are not. Most of them are, I think you gave me the expression, extraordinarily ordinary people. People who see something happening in their neighborhood that is terrifying and are moved in that moment to do something about it. They encouraged us repeatedly to try to replicate this hyper local organizing, which begins with reaching out to your immediate neighbors, maybe for a potluck first, and then say, "Oh, are you interested in being a part of a signal loop?" And then out of there, we heard from one woman who said she started a Google Doc. And first there were 5 to 10 people on the Google Doc, and then there were 50 to 70 people on the Google Doc, and then within a matter of weeks, there were 1,200 people on this Google Doc that this woman just started. Nobody told her how to do it. But then the Google Doc gets organized
Right.
between patrols and grocery deliveries and school drop-offs and pickups and appointments. It's remarkable the level of very grassroots, neighbor to neighbor organizing that's happening. And it's not activist, it's totally peaceful. And just to underscore that, while we were there at this event, they came in and announced, and the event was like hearing from 8 or 9 of these neighborhood activists what their experience had been. And it was heart wrenching. At some point, somebody pulled up a phone and said, "Here, another day in Minneapolis. I'm getting a text that there is a 3-month-old that needs breast milk because the mother was just abducted
Mm.
by."
I get chills when you tell us that story. The extraordinarily ordinary people thrust into an extraordinary moment.
Yes.
But you rose.
They're doing it together,
Responded.
and they're doing it. We're in this church, and then and they had just been talking about how this church had become a place of sanctuary for the community, and had always been a place of sanctuary, but a place where the church would take care of its own, feeding groceries. They'd said that on Sunday mornings they cleared their chancel and set up beds for body work and massage and Reiki, because that's what they had heard from the people that they needed most to kind of get through this daily trauma.
Mhm.
While we were there, we had our own moment of encounter where they put the building on lockdown and said 2 blocks away there was a interrupted abduction, and ICE was involved, and 3 people were injured. Those 3 people had been brought to the basement of the church and were being treated while we were there. And there again, this community of faith leaders kind of we heard our instructions to stay put, but then we all stood up and we prayed through the floor, healing prayers for those 3 individuals who were hurt. Later, I saw a video of the documentation of how this woman got hurt. She was following another group of clergy from our cohort that was doing a pilgrimage. ICE was following them. ICE peeled off from following them, but she continued to follow ICE. The ICE car in front of her, she's got a video on this, stopped, came out, bashed through her front window within 30 seconds.
Mm.
And her face was filled with glass, and she had glass in her mouth.
Mm.
She was doing nothing illegal. These jackboot tactics are fierce and terrifying. And yet the courage of this woman to keep filming, and her partner to keep filming as they were trying to wrest her out of the car, and saying, "I am not doing anything illegal," as she's been trained to do. It was remarkable. So
Wow. I can't imagine. And I want to emphasize the fact that I believe this is a moment, a Kairos moment.
yeah.
There's great peril, but there's great potential to be what we are called to be. That's all I'm saying. And people have to decide, what kind of trauma did you see there?
I saw there were a few immigrants who we connected with. Most were too afraid to come out to an event or be in public. At that immigrant church, there were people whose some of whose family had been kidnapped, abducted, taken away by ICE. That was one level of trauma. I think what I encountered more was the the trauma that people experience by virtue of being on these patrols, of doing exactly what Renee Good was doing, and encountering the force of these federal agents, and the terror of these federal agents coming up to their car windows, or putting themselves in the midst of ICE agents breaking into people's houses. Heard from a lawyer who was right there. She got pepper sprayed 8 times in that day, and so, but beautifully, this well organized community that had been organizing since before the days of George Floyd. There were movement chaplains then who kind of sprang into action when those activists and protests were happening in Minneapolis. They kind of got swept up again into this moment of caring for their neighbors. And each day from 8:30 to 9 p.m., there is a Zoom call that anybody can show up for if you've witnessed an assault, if you've witnessed an abduction, if you have been a part of trying to follow ICE and blow whistles and honk horns, and there was some scuffle. Come together, ground yourself, sing some somatic embodied practices to restore people's nervous systems, that are incredibly activated all around the system. I mean, all around the city. I mean, I think all of us around the country are activated by what we see on TV,
Mhm.
but to be on the other side of the cameras is extraordinary.
Hmm. We often talk about post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic stress, but this is trying to do and healing that. But
Mhm.
this is trying to, your presence was an attempt to heal in the midst of trauma. That's a little different. This is not a memory. This is something that's ongoing. And so it's about taking care of ourselves in chaos. Is that even possible? Can we do that when you know another attack or another traumatic hit could come at any minute?
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that, but it strikes me that the clergy there had the presence of mind not only to be responding to the daily, like, rapid response kind of needs that were flooding their phones and their texts and their signal chats. They had the presence of mind to invite 600 other clergy there, not only so that we could come and bear witness, but so that they could train us, so that they could tell us what we needed to bring back to our own communities. That's like that level of generosity of spirit, to not only have your own crisis unfolding daily, these daily emergencies, but to say, Minneapolis is just the start. They actually learn what they learned from Chicago and from LA, and they were on Zoom calls in December, learning what the tactics were, learning about whistles. And now hardly anybody I saw in Minnesota doesn't walk around with a whistle.
Mm,
Um, how do
mm,
we bring these kind of tactics back? Later in the day, there was a beautiful moment. And you could bring up the screen again, the photo again. 50,000 people strong, minus 20-degree weather, for a protest in Minneapolis, and it was fierce. The people of Minneapolis are angry. They have had it. They want ICE out, and yet this totally peaceful protests, scattered with faith leaders and people of conscience, 50,000 people strong out there. Later, we gathered at the Target Center, and I think there's a photo of that too. And there was joy in the streets, resistance, yes, but joy and a power of coming together. So I think that might be a lesson here as well, that courage is contagious.
mhm.
When when they asked on Thursday, when they asked us to stand up and go to the buses, I stood up, but I was shaky about it. It wasn't until I got into the lobby and saw 3 other colleagues who were also there that I felt my nervous system settle. It was dramatic. I'm like, "Oh, I know people. I'm not like, we're in this together." And that was a takeaway for me, that I don't think anybody can do this work alone. Um,
Mhm.
We have to do this work together. I think that's what the people of Minneapolis have learned. I think that's what they're teaching us, this neighbor to neighbor outreach, this love of neighbor. The woman who was in the picture before, the clergy woman, Rebecca Vocal, gathered us, and she says, the resistance here is beautiful, bodacious, faithful, and fierce.
Mm, mm, mm.
Matt, like you get a sense the second you walk into the street that you are not alone because there are so many people pushing back against ICE, pushing back against authoritarianism. And there is just a sense of, I mean, it was super intense to be there, but also super inspiring to
Right.
see what love can do, what relationships can do, what organizing can do. Just so powerful.
You are already doing this, but I'm going to ask the question anyway, which I think you've already begun to answer. There's so many people that look at this as just a political issue, and we don't want to talk about politics in the church. But this, to me, is a spiritual experience. So, how do you tell your congregation? How do you tell your friends that this? How do you explain the spiritual part of this? And I think you already did it with love, right? I mean, this is how you show up, right?
I think it's love and I think it's power too. And so King would say, you've heard this quote, Liz, I'm sure, that power without love is domination. We're encountering that in Minnesota, in other places, just raw physical power and force, extracting people from their families. King also said, love without power is sentimentality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What I experienced in Minneapolis was love and power together, which King called justice. Justice, I know it's been a word that's been weaponized almost as a political word, but to be on the streets and to see the love of neighbor, people who don't even know each other, showing up and putting their bodies on the line, putting themselves between an ICE vehicle and a house, knowing that by blowing their whistles, by honking their horns, by standing there, they might interrupt that abduction and send ICE, off in their vehicles. There's something so powerful about that love neighbor. That is straight from the Bible.
Mm.
Also, hating or loving your enemies. I mean, like there has to be some love that's not going to have us react in kind with violence towards the ICE agents. Like I've heard from colleagues there who have been at the Whipple building, which some have compared to a concentration camp. It's the detention center right in the middle of Minneapolis, where ICE agents stand there. And I heard one person talking about just trying to catch that person's eye, to humanize them and to try to say, hey, how's your day going? Not with judgment so much. Of course, there's that, but to try to find a way of loving that, even that neighbor in your heart. That
Mhm.
is spiritual work, I think, but it's also work that requires practice, which is why I went, because I needed some practice in that. And I think, unfortunately, I'm afraid we're all going to have a chance to practice. But it starts sometimes in church basements and in gatherings where people can come together, ground themselves in those values of our faith, and then get out into the streets.
Yeah, because action needs contemplation. You can't just have action without having something to ground you, which is contemplative work, I believe.
Absolutely.
So the magnitude of this and the depth of this, that ongoing issue in Minneapolis, and you kind of have already touched on this a bit, but tell us more. This is something we're all going to have to confront one way or the other in the months and years ahead, you believe, right?
I do. I'll share a story. A person in Cotuit on Cape Cod this past Sunday shared a very powerful testimony about her two daughters who are adopted. They are Asian American, and she is terrified for them. One lives in Portland, which has seen an increased ICE presence. One lives in Somerville, and I think what has begun in Minneapolis, the kind of organizing, the kind of teaching and training and tactics and strategies, including sharing like songbooks, like resistance songs and that kind of things. It's not just the neighborhood organizing or the signal apps. It's the grounding too. I think that is spreading now to places like Portland and to other places where I expect ICE will show up. Minneapolis was convinced that they were a test case, and they were chosen for a reason because there is such a strong, organized, faithful presence there. It is true. And I think that the administration maybe thought, well, if we can break Minneapolis, then we've got the rest of the country. Not true. They have not broken Minneapolis. Minneapolis is not backing down. The resistance there is massive, massive, massive. People said, I don't know anybody who is not working there every single spare hour to try to do something to help their neighbors, showing up from 7 to 10 a.m. for shifts to protect the perimeter around a school, things like that. People are showing up there, and I think we have to be prepared to show up and do sometimes unextraordinary things of just witness and holding a camera, as dangerous as it might be.
Some of us feel so I think most of us feel so powerless around the news that is coming out of Minneapolis and just the news of the world and the trauma of.
Mhm.
You talked a little bit about power when we started this conversation.
Yeah.
How does being there in Minneapolis and taking part in this, again, very courageous protest and this very courageous movement, how does that change your definition of power and our power as just regular people?
I used to through organizations like the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, where we did some work together, these faith-based community organizations. They talk about power, and I would always talk about power as organized people and organized money. That is still true for me, but there's something else that's happening in Minneapolis, and I think something else that's needed. And it's a mobilization. It's not just organizing; it's mobilizing people in vast numbers to do something. And I think when people feel powerless, sometimes they think, "Well, I have to go out into the streets, or I have to go do something courageous." That is not what I witnessed there. I did see that, and there were clergy who were doing that kind of thing, but I think what they wanted us to take back was a message about the power of reaching out to your neighbor, building relational power right in your own block, right in your own building, getting to know your neighbors so that if and when ICE does come or something else comes, there is that relational power that nothing can break. It's a spiritual power. I heard somebody talk about it being a soul force to resist the physical force of domination and empire right now that is coming into many cities. So I don't know if that's a very coherent answer, but I
It
think
is.
something about the relationships that our people have formed there in a very immediate way. This is not abstract. This is not rocket science. It's about having a potluck this weekend to get to know your neighbors and saying, what could we do next? How about a Google Doc? Should we order some whistles? Huh.
Mhm.
That kind of thing. That is power. That is people taking agency and working together towards resistance. And that builds and it builds and it becomes massive and beautiful and bodacious and faithful and fierce, like I saw in Minneapolis.
And I would just add to that, if you're not at the point where you want to get whistles, just get to know your neighbors.
Yes,
That's
exactly.
Take that one step. I read somewhere it's planting hope where you stand,
Mm.
that you don't have to go somewhere to find hope, that you are the hope, which sounds a little cliche-ish, but cliches are based on truth usually. So we can say that. Um,
One more image I want to share that was given to me there that I haven't been able to shake. Somebody said that the kind of organizing that has happened, the kind of power that has happened, it's not sort of like a military structure where people are like lining up in very organized ways. They said it's more like a murmuration of starlings.
mm,
you imagine like birds flocking together and kind of following and going in a similar direction? That's what we saw in the streets of Minneapolis, where these murmurations of starlings, 6, 7,
Mm.
10, 20, 30 birds just coming together to be more powerful together than any one of them were alone. And that murmuration sometimes creates enough of a ripple that it sends ICE, it sends the administration, it puts them on their back heels. Um,
Mm.
because it's so beautiful to see these kind of swirling relationships working together for love and against hate.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And it puts the church right where the, because I'm a church girl. I'm a Jesus girl. I was born in the church. I'll die in the church. But it puts the church where the church should be in taking an active role. How has you, as we wrap this up, and this has been
Mhm.
a wonderful conversation, how has all this changed you?
It's given me some questions to discern about how and where I'm called to show up where I am now. I live on Cape Cod. I don't live in a city anymore, and so there's some translation that I think I'm doing and trying to discern. Okay, what is it like to build relationships with my neighbors here, which I'm doing, and but it's also making me feel that the work I've already kind of been doing in terms of reckoning with the legacies of slavery and white supremacy and colonization and all of that, it's all a part of the same work. We heard when we were there a very powerful grounding in the land offered by a native leader who said, this place between the Minnesota and the Mississippi River, it is sacred ground, and it is a place of Genesis, of beautiful creation. It's also a place of genocide.
Mm.
It's continuing even now. And so to sort of like ground ourselves in that deeper work, not just the what do I do? What do I do? But to understand that these patterns that we're seeing exacted right now, they're not, they're not new.
No.
Like things like this have been happening for generations and decades. That's where that, echo of Selma comes in. Like, what do we need to learn from prior generations, from ancestors who have kind of pushed through these federal forces, like Fugitive Slave Act, those kinds of things, and to ground ourselves all the more on the side of love and justice.
Mm. Well, Dan, I'm so glad you had the time. You made the time to join us. I was thinking you were speaking of something I heard long time ago. Those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it. And
Mm.
I wonder if sometimes that's why this is just on and on because we haven't learned. And you have certainly shown us that there is much learning to do. And thank you for sharing your learning with us.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you so much. I've shared with you before a quote from Dr. King that he said, "The truth crushed to earth will rise again."
Yeah.
Boy, is that happening in places like Minneapolis. And it is hopeful to see that rising, even in the midst of so much pain and struggle. That
Absolutely. I
really
thank you so
appreciate.
much, Dan, to bring up, we now know why he's a prophet. Here we go again, right? That's what makes a prophet, to speak truth. And thank you for your prophetic work and sharing it with us. And we thank you all for joining us today on From the Heart. We have more deep conversations like this because we have to. We have to talk about this. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again. Bye, everybody. Bye. Thanks, Dan.